We are embarking on an extensive exploration today. We're examining the life and work of a figure who really stands alone in how he transformed our understanding of our own place in the natural world.
Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin. We're tracing the journey of the English naturalist, geologist, biologist born in 1809, and we're trying to understand how his very unique path led to what was arguably the most profound scientific revolution of the 19th century.
It's a remarkable story, and we're going to look at the entire arc of his existence. We've synthesized biographical accounts, his own writings, scientific papers, to really map out his, let's say, his unexpected educational trajectory.
Right.
And then that pivotal 5-year voyage that became his living laboratory.
The voyage on the Beagle.
Exactly. And after that, the decades of meticulous, almost secret research, and then the immense social and intellectual upheaval that followed his publications.
And I think that's where the central tension lies, isn't it? It's almost unbelievable.
It is.
Here's a man who was initially preparing for a quintessential, respectable Victorian career. He was training to be an Anglican country parson.
The life of a gentleman naturalist, yes.
And he ends up formulating a theory of purely natural mechanistic change, natural selection, a theory that it completely removed the need for divine intervention in the creation of species. Our mission today is to trace the precise steps that bridge that enormous gap.
To go from orthodox belief to revolutionary science.
Exactly.
And his core proposition, that's the intellectual force of his legacy, isn't it? The idea that all species of life have descended from common ancestors.
Through this gradual, relentless process.
Natural selection. It's now the essential unifying theory of all biological sciences. So we need to understand exactly how Darwin built that argument brick by painstaking brick.
So let's start at the beginning. Shrewsbury, 1809. Darwin was born into a family that wasn't just wealthy, they were deeply entrenched in Britain's intellectual and industrial elite.
That's a key point. His father, Robert Darwin, was a successful, almost formidable doctor and financier.
And the lineage on both sides is it's incredible. It's key to understanding his later radicalism.
It absolutely is. His grandfathers were giants. On his father's side, you have Erasmus Darwin,
who had already published Zoonomia.
Yes, a work that discussed these general concepts of evolution and common descent. It didn't have a mechanism, not like natural selection, but it established a precedent in the family for non-orthodox scientific thinking. The idea was already in the air, so to speak.
And on his mother's side?
The Wedgwoods. Prominent industrialists, radical thinkers. His grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, was a dedicated abolitionist, and that influence on Darwin's moral compass, on his anti-slavery views, would be absolutely indelible.
So even though the family was officially Anglican, he was exposed to these progressive, maybe even proto-evolutionary ideas from the very beginning.
For sure. But despite this amazing intellectual pedigree, his own formal education seemed, awkward. It was directionless for a long time.
Almost a comedy of errors at first.
You could say that. His father intended him for medicine, sent him to the University of Edinburgh in 1825.
A top medical school at the time.
One of the best. But Darwin, he found the lectures dull, and he was absolutely traumatized by the sight of surgery.
Which, we have to remember, was performed without anesthesia then.
Exactly. It was brutal. He openly admitted to just neglecting his medical studies entirely. He couldn't do it.
But this period of neglect, it led to a really formative experience that often gets overlooked. While he was avoiding the anatomy theater, he acquired a critical skill.
Taxidermy.
Yes. And he learned it from a very unusual tutor, an interaction that really shaped his moral and social views.
His tutor was John Edmonston. He was a freed Black Briton who had previously been enslaved and worked in the rainforests of Demerara in South America.
So he had first-hand knowledge.
Immense knowledge of preserving specimens. Darwin spent 40 daily, hour-long sessions with him. This personal relationship was so significant, Darwin later recalled Edmonston as a very pleasant and intelligent man.
And you have to think about the context of the 1820s.
Precisely. This early, respectful, intellectual interaction with a Black man of profound skill. It reinforced Darwin's innate belief in the shared mental capabilities of all races. It really laid the groundwork for his later ferocious abolitionism.
That's a fascinating, and you're right, an under-examined influence. But beyond Edmonston, Edinburgh wasn't a total loss for him scientifically.
No, not at all. He engaged with real science. He joined the Radical Plinian Society.
Radical how?
They were questioning everything. They were materialists, many of them. He also assisted a man named Robert Edmund Grant in investigating marine invertebrates. He even presented his own minor discovery in March of 1827.
What was that?
He identified these little black spores in oyster shells as the eggs of a skate leech. So you see the spark is there. He has the eye of a naturalist.
He had the scientific spark, but no direction.
None. So when the medical path failed, his father, completely frustrated, redirected him, sent him to Christ's College, Cambridge, starting in 1828.
And the goal now?
To get a Bachelor of Arts degree. This was the prerequisite for becoming a highly respectable Anglican country parson.
What a pivot. From surgeon to clergyman.
It was a path for a gentleman of his station. But even at Cambridge, his passion for natural science just kept pulling him away from theology. He preferred writing, shooting, and, most notably, he developed this zealous obsession with collecting beetles.
Influenced by his cousin, right? William Darwin Fox.
Yes, and he was incredibly good at it. Some of his beetle finds were actually published in Illustrations of British Entomology. This wasn't just a hobby.
It was meticulous, systematic fieldwork.
Exactly. And this zeal, this passion, connected him with the man who would truly prepare him for his destiny, the botany professor John Stevens Henslow.
Henslow became his mentor.
His absolute mentor. Darwin became Henslow's favorite protege. He was known around Cambridge as the man who walks with Henslow.
And Henslow really curated Darwin's intellectual preparation, didn't he? He led him to the foundational texts of the era.
He did. Darwin devoured William Paley's natural theology,
which argued that the complexity of nature, the intricate design of an eye, for instance, could only be the result of a divine designer.
The classic watchmaker argument. And Paley's logic was compelling and rigorous. Darwin later said he appreciated the clear, methodical construction of the argument, even after he'd abandoned the conclusion.
So it taught him how to build a case.
It taught him that complexity demanded a logical, explanatory framework. And crucially, he also read John Herschel's preliminary discourse.
What was the message there?
Herschel urged young scientists to discover the deep, hidden natural laws of the universe through exhaustive observation and inductive reasoning. It was a direct mandate for empirical scientific discovery.
And then came the romance of it all, the call to adventure.
Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative. Humboldt painted this picture of scientific exploration in exotic places as the highest possible calling. Darwin was so inspired he started making his own plans to go to Tenerife with some friends.
So all of this combined meant that by the time he finished his degree, and he did well, he came 10th out of 178 candidates in January 1831.
He was intellectually primed. He might have been aiming for the clergy, but he was equipped with the methodical rigor of a geologist, the classification skills of a biologist, and the observational zeal of an explorer.
Which brought him to the moment the whole trajectory of his life changed forever. Instead of a paid parish position or that trip to Tenerife, he gets a letter from Henslow.
A letter offering a far, far greater opportunity.
A spot on HMS Beagle.
Indeed. Henslow proposed him for a self-funded supernumerary position. The ship's mission was to chart the coastline of South America, and the captain, Robert Fitzroy.
A very aristocratic, devoutly religious man.
He needed an educated gentleman companion. He specifically wanted someone who was not a mere collector to share the long, lonely voyage with.
But this created immediate conflict at home.
Oh, yes. His father, Robert Darwin, instantly objected. He thought it was an idle pursuit, a complete waste of time, and likely dangerous for a young man who had already, in his eyes, failed at 2 career paths.
So what changed his mind?
It took the intervention of Charles's influential uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II. He persuaded his father not only to agree, but also to provide the necessary funding for the trip.
And that funding was critical.
Absolutely critical. It allowed Darwin to retain control over all his collections, ensuring they would be properly studied by the scientific community back home, rather than being claimed by the Navy. The voyage was secured. The ship set sail in December 1831.
5 years at sea. It sounds romantic, but the reality for Darwin was just chronic, severe seasickness for virtually the entire voyage.
A constant misery. Yet despite this physical suffering while aboard, he spent the vast majority of his time, almost 3 full years, cumulatively ashore.
He transformed into a relentless field scientist.
Completely. While Captain Fitzroy was charting the coasts, Darwin was focused on geology and making these massive collections. He didn't initially think of himself as a zoological expert. His plan was just to send back immense quantities of specimens carefully labeled and boxed for the established experts in London to analyze.
And he wasn't going in blind, conceptually. Fitzroy had given him a book, just before they left.
The first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, this was the key intellectual map for the entire voyage.
And what was Lyell's big idea?
Uniformitarianism. This was a radical concept at the time. The idea that the same geological processes shaping the Earth today, erosion, volcanism, uplift, have operated consistently and gradually over vast, vast stretches of time.
Not in big, sudden catastrophes.
Exactly. He was arguing against catastrophism, the prevailing view that Earth's history was shaped by sudden, massive global floods or other events.
And Darwin found immediate, powerful confirmation of Lyell's idea.
Right away. On the very first stop in the Cape Verde Islands at St. Jago, he found a layer of seashells high up in the volcanic rock cliffs.
So the land itself had risen.
Slowly, gradually, over immense time, just as Lyell had proposed. This observation was fundamentally important because it broke him decisively from catastrophism. It gave Darwin the intellectual gift of deep time,
Without which evolution is impossible.
it simply could not occur slowly enough to produce the diversity of life he was about to see. He needed an incredibly old Earth for his later theory to work. Geology gave him that.
And the geology quickly led to some shocking paleontology. When they reached Patagonia, near a place called Punta Alta, he made his greatest fossil discovery of the journey.
He uncovered fossil bones of colossal extinct mammals, the Megatherium, a giant ground sloth, the Toxodon, the armored Glyptodon.
Giant regions of creatures we know today.
Exactly. And what was truly astonishing was that these massive, extinct bones were found right beside modern seashells. That indicated they had become extinct relatively recently, with no dramatic global catastrophe to blame.
So why does that matter so much? Why was that so challenging to the existing dogma?
Because it demonstrated this powerful geographical continuity. When these finds were later analyzed back in London by the great anatomist Richard Owen, he confirmed that these giant fossils were structurally related to the small living armadillos and sloths found only in South America today.
So the implication is,
It was staggering. Why would a creator populate one geographic area, South America, with giant extinct versions of creatures that only live there today? It suggested that species don't just get created and fixed in place. They become extinct, but their descendants, or at least their local relatives, continue the lineage in the same area through modification.
the law of succession of types, he called it.
Precisely. And he also witnessed live geological change in Chile in 1835. He was there for a violent earthquake.
And saw the aftermath.
He saw mussel beds that had been stranded several feet above the high tide line, conclusive evidence that the land had been raised right before his very eyes. This observational power fueled all his theories. He later theorized that as continental land masses rise, oceanic islands must sink, and that coral reefs would grow upward around them, eventually forming those ring-shaped atolls.
A major geological contribution in its own right.
It solidified his scientific reputation long before Origin of Species even appeared.
But beyond the rocks and fossils, he started seeing these species puzzles that just resisted the idea of fixed creation.
Right. He learned from the gauchos in the Patagonian interior that there were two similar types of rhea, these large flightless birds, and they had separate but slightly overlapping territories. Their distribution seemed linked to subtle geographical boundaries.
Another anomaly.
Another piece of the puzzle, and then, of course, they reached the Galapagos Islands.
Now, this is often mythologized as the moment the light bulb went on, the eureka moment.
But the sources show the realization was actually much more delayed and piecemeal, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It's the great myth of the Darwin story. He observed the mockingbirds and noted that they differed from island to island. That was a key observation.
But what's the critical piece of information he failed to collect, which he later kicked himself for?
The tortoise shells. He didn't consistently collect them or even label them based on their island of origin. He was still conceptually locked into the idea of a fixed center of creation.
So he just heard about the variation from others.
Mostly, yes. From the vice-governor of the islands, who mentioned he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. The full significance of the finches, the 12 distinct species, was only revealed much, much later, back in London.
When the ornithologist John Gould looked at his collection.
Exactly. Gould was the one who told him, these aren't just varieties, these are distinct species.
So the voyage wasn't just about science, it was also crucial for his moral development.
Immensely so. He witnessed the absolute brutality of slavery in Brazil. And it led to these open and fierce disputes with Captain Fitzroy, who actually defended the institution. Darwin, the grandson of Josiah Wedgwood, was a lifelong abolitionist.
And his encounters with the native Fuegians in Tierra del Fuego further cemented his understanding of human commonality.
This is a fascinating part of the story. He met three who had been brought to England on a previous voyage and given a Christian education, and he contrasted them with the, quote, miserable, degraded savages he encountered locally.
So how did his initial shock at their condition transition into a deeper scientific conclusion?
Despite the staggering perceived difference, he became utterly convinced that all humans shared a common origin and possessed the same potential for improvement in civilization. He saw no unbridgeable gap between humans and animals, a truly radical thought for the era.
And this was reinforced when they returned a year later, wasn't it?
It was. They found the civilized Fuegian, a young man named Jemmy Button, had completely abandoned his English customs. He was living like the other natives and had no wish to return to England.
So what did Darwin take from that?
It showed him that savagery wasn't a fixed racial state. It was a product of environmental and cultural context. It reinforced his view of a single, shared humanity.
So if we look back at the whole voyage, all this raw data he collected, extinct giants related to modern armadillos, land rising from the sea, species varying subtly across tiny distances, and a clear realization of shared human potential, these were all anomalies.
Right. There are puzzles that demanded a completely revolutionary new mechanism to explain them. The old answers just didn't work anymore.
So when Darwin returned to Falmouth in October 1836, he was no longer an obscure student. His letters, which Henslow had been circulating and even printing, had already made him a significant figure of scientific interest.
He was already a little bit famous in the right circles.
He was, and he immediately began consolidating his position among the scientific elite. He met with Charles Lyell and with the leading anatomist of the day, Richard Owen.
And Owen's analysis of the Patagonian fossils was the first major scientific validation.
It was huge. Owen confirmed that those giant extinct beasts were indeed relatives of living South American species. This fundamentally challenged the idea of the fixity of species. It was powerful evidence.
But the true conceptual turning point, the final inescapable piece of evidence, came from the ornithologist John Gould and the Galapagos collection.
Yes, Gould delivered the final blow to the old worldview. He informed Darwin that the birds he'd collected weren't mere varieties of finches or blackbirds. There were 12 distinct but closely related species of finches, plus distinct species of mockingbirds, all distributed by island.
And that is the moment where the traditional view of a fixed, single creation event must have just collapsed completely for him.
It had to. The idea that God created separate, fixed species for each of these tiny, insignificant volcanic islands suddenly became scientifically absurd. If these closely related but distinct creatures arose in isolation, how did one form become another?
He realized he had to invent a natural mechanism for species transmutation.
By early 1837, he's living in London, and he starts grappling with this idea in his red notebook. He tentatively writes that one species does change into another.
A very dangerous thought to put on paper.
Extremely, and this intensified very quickly. By May-July of 1837, he started his seminal B notebook on the transmutation of species.
And this is where he drew the famous sketch.
The famous sketch.
Yeah.
The first graphic representation of the idea, a single branching structure, a genealogical tree of life. And crucially, above that sketch, he wrote 2 words. I think.
Showing the tentativeness, the enormity of the step he was taking.
Exactly. And this visualization, this tree, was a massive philosophical break. It rejected the older progressionist concept, the idea of a ladder of life, often associated with Lamarck, that suggested life moved up a simple ladder toward higher, more complex forms.
Darwin's tree implied common ancestry and horizontal diversity, not hierarchy.
That's right. It meant all life was simply adapted to its local circumstances. He concluded, it is absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. He had overthrown the philosophical basis for biological hierarchy.
And to build this framework, he started systematically seeking out empirical data on how variation actually arose.
Right. And he went to unconventional sources. He interviewed practical experts, farmers, breeders, pigeon fanciers, people who specialized in artificial selection.
He wanted to see change in action.
He was systematically building 2 sides of the coin. Variation, which is the raw material, and the filter, which is the selective force. And the selective force, the mechanism itself, finally arrived in October of 1838.
This is the famed Malthusian spark. He was reading, for amusement he said, Thomas Malthus's Informant, an essay on the principle of population.
And Malthus provided the mathematical inevitability for his theory. Malthus asserted that human populations, if unchecked, double every 25 years, inevitably outstripping the food supply. This leads to mass competition, famine, war, a struggle for existence.
And Darwin was already intimately aware of that struggle in the wild from his voyage.
Absolutely. When he applied Malthus's model that far more creatures are born than can possibly survive, it mathematically transformed that struggle into a constant, relentless, selective mechanism.
So the struggle for life wasn't just some grim fact. It was the engine that drove evolutionary change.
Precisely. He realized that this inherent population-driven competition ensured that any being with a profitable slight variation, a slightly better camouflage, slightly better resistance to a disease, would have a statistically better chance of surviving and reproducing.
And these favorable traits would therefore be preserved.
And unfavorable ones would be destroyed. The result of this, he wrote, would be the formation of new species. He called this Malthusian sorting process natural selection.
And he compared this powerful, naturally operating mechanism directly to the way farmers artificially select the best livestock.
He did. He noted that this comparison was a beautiful part of my theory. Natural selection was the filter that ensured that structures, whether it was a finch's beak or a fossilized shell, were always fully practical and perfected for their environment.
Now, you just have to imagine the intense intellectual pressure of holding this world-altering secret, while also being bogged down editing the multi-volume zoology of the voyage of HMS Beagle.
A huge, complex, administrative task. The stress was immense, and it took a heavy physical toll. This period marks the onset of his chronic, debilitating illness.
What were the symptoms?
It started in September 1837 with an uncomfortable palpitation of the heart. It led to lifelong, debilitating symptoms. Severe headaches, chronic stomach problems, vomiting, trembling. His health would invariably collapse during times of intense intellectual strain or controversy.
And this physical suffering was intertwined with major personal commitments.
Yes. He decided, based on this meticulous list of pros and cons, which included the classic, rather unromantic line that marriage was better than a dog anyhow, to marry his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in January 1839.
But Emma was a devout Unitarian, and his revolutionary materialistic theory was a deep emotional threat to her faith.
It created this profound, lifelong emotional tension. Emma wrote him these loving letters expressing genuine concern that his honest doubts about Orthodox religion, that his scientific speculations might actually separate them in the afterlife.
She feared for his soul.
She truly did, and the anxiety of their differing views contributed to his immense personal stress, especially given his fragile health. She pleaded with him in one letter, "So don't be ill anymore, my dear Charlie, till I can be with you to nurse you."
They ultimately had a devoted family, 10 children in all, though it was a life marked by immense tragedy.
It was. We must acknowledge the sorrow of the death of his infant son, Charles Waring, who was likely mentally subnormal, in 1858. And even more devastating was the loss of his 10-year-old daughter, Annie, in 1851 after a long illness.
And that loss was profound.
It broke his remaining adherence to Orthodox belief. He was also plagued by fears that his own chronic, mysterious illness might be hereditary, because he and Emma were first cousins. This confluence of personal tragedy, chronic suffering, and his scientific observations of inherent cruelty in nature, like the ichneumon wasp,
which lays its eggs in living caterpillars.
Yes. All of this served as a powerful, non-negotiable argument against a benevolent designer.
So to escape the pressures of London and maybe the mental burden of his radical ideas, Darwin moved his family to a down house in rural Kent in 1842. And for nearly 2 decades, refining the theory of natural selection was what he called his prime hobby.
His prime hobby, yes. But he kept the theory entirely private. Publicly, he maintained his reputation as a meticulous orthodox scientist. He published The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs in 1842, a brilliant work applying Lyell's geology to explain atoll formation.
And then came the famous, monumental barnacle saga, an 8-year detour from 1846 to 1854 devoted entirely to the classification and dissection of barnacles. 8 years.
It seems like an enormous delay for a man sitting on the secret of creation.
It does. What was the scientific purpose behind this incredible dedication?
It was absolutely crucial for two reasons. Firstly, it brought him undeniable scientific credibility. After this work, he was universally recognized as a master systematist. He won the Royal Medal in 1853 for it. No one could dismiss him as an amateur speculator.
Okay, so it established his credentials.
And secondly, and this is scientifically essential, it forced him to define the very concept of a species in minute practical detail across vast geographic ranges. He was studying variation and classification firsthand at the most granular level.
So the barnacle work wasn't just busy work. It was a rigorous, self-imposed training exercise. It proved to him, definitively, that his evolutionary framework was correct, even at the messiest level of biological variation.
Exactly. His private theory was guiding his research. It helped him find homologies, structural similarities pointing to common ancestry, and even intermediate evolutionary stages like these bizarre, minute, parasitic males he found clinging to hermaphrodites in some barnacle genera. This provided the indispensable taxonomic evidence that gave weight to his later claims.
Yet, when he finally finished, his personal aspiration was clear.
He famously declared, "I hate a barnacle as no man ever did before."
By 1844, he'd already expanded his private notes into a comprehensive 230-page essay. He knew how explosive the contents were.
He did. He confided in his friend, the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, that detailing his ideas felt ominously like confessing a murder.
But the secrecy couldn't last forever.
No. By 1856, Charles Lyell became anxious. He strongly urged Darwin to publish, not least because of a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace,
who was working in the Malay archipelago in Borneo.
And Wallace was publishing essays that showed a worrying conceptual overlap with Darwin's own ideas about geographical distribution and species change. Lyell saw the risk of Darwin losing priority.
So Darwin started working intensely on his massive manuscript, his big book on species, provisionally titled Natural Selection.
He did. Though he planned a section on man, he deliberately avoided writing the full text on it, noting that the subject was so surrounded with prejudices. He was still holding back.
And then the pressure cooker burst. June 18th, 1858.
Darwin received a package from Wallace. Inside was a paper, the Ternat Essay, which described the mechanism of natural selection almost perfectly. Darwin was devastated. He felt forestalled.
And compounding this professional crisis was a deep personal one.
Yes. His infant son, Charles Waring, was dying of scarlet fever. He was distraught and couldn't attend to the matter personally. He delegated the entire complex ethical dilemma to his trusted friends, Lyell and Hooker.
What did they decide to do?
Their solution was a compromise. It was aimed at preserving Darwin's decades of precedence while still respecting Wallace's independent discovery. They decided on an immediate joint presentation of both Darwin's earlier unpublished sketch from 1844 and Wallace's new paper.
To the Linnean Society of London on July 1st, 1858.
Yes. Darwin, still reeling from the loss of his son, did not attend. And the reaction to this monumental joint announcement was, well, it was surprisingly muted.
Remarkably underwhelming.
But president of the Linnean Society even remarked at the end of the year that the year had not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries.
Incredible.
Darwin was stung by one early critic who claimed all that was new in them was false, and what was true was old. But the clock was ticking. He realized he had to abandon his massive detailed work and just rush out an abstract.
And that abstract became On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life.
Published on November 27, 1859. It was an instant cultural phenomenon. The initial print run of 12,250 copies was entirely oversubscribed immediately. Booksellers were desperate for copies.
And the book itself laid out one long argument, leveraging all his observations from the Beagle, the knowledge from breeders, the barnacle systematics, the logic of Malthus. He made the mechanism accessible and compelling.
In the introduction, he stated the core truth very simply. Because more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, any being with a profitable slight variation will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. And this naturally selected variation, due to the strong principle of inheritance, would then propagate its new form across generations.
He was incredibly cautious about humans in this first edition, though. He almost entirely avoided the implication.
Almost. He used a single powerful sentence near the end to hint at the future of his work. He wrote, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." He saved the explicit discussion for 12 years later.
And he closed the book with this flourish, lifting the whole concept from dry science into a vision of cosmic scope.
That final sentence is iconic. He spoke of the grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and concluded that whilst the planet cycles on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
That one word, evolved, in the very final paragraph.
It signaled the profound conceptual shift he was demanding of the entire world.
So the origin of species explodes onto the global stage, and while Darwin remained mostly sequestered at Down House because of his chronic poor health, the battle over his ideas was fought publicly and viciously.
The war was led by Thomas Henry Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog.
A great nickname.
Huxley was relentless. He campaigned fiercely against the prevailing influence of the clergy in scientific matters. He saw evolution not just as a theory, but as a crucial tool to professionalize science, to elevate it above theological authority.
And the cultural flashpoint for this was the 1860 Oxford debate.
Yes. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam for his rhetorical skill, argued against the theory and specifically against the idea of human descent from apes.
And this is where Huxley delivered his famous, legendary retort.
He did. He stated that he would prefer to be descended from an ape than from a man who misused his intellectual gifts in the service of theological prejudice. It became this symbolic moment, a perceived triumph of scientific materialism over orthodox religion in the popular imagination.
It's interesting, though, while evolution itself, descent with modification, was largely accepted by the scientific community by the 1870s, natural selection wasn't universally embraced as the chief mechanism.
No, not until much later. Not until the modern evolutionary synthesis of the 1930s through the 1950s, when Mendelian genetics provided the missing piece on how inheritance actually worked.
But Darwin did receive critical, observable evidence during his lifetime to support his theory.
He did. In America, the paleontologist Othniel C. Marsh provided solid fossil evidence by unearthing the ancestors of the modern horse. He found a clear, gradual evolutionary sequence over time in the fossil record.
The predictive power of his theory confirmed.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the profound shift in Darwin's personal faith. He moved from his Anglican intent through Unitarianism and eventually settled on agnosticism by 1879. How did his personal struggles feed this intellectual change?
His faith was, I think, irrevocably broken by the death of his beloved daughter Annie in 1851. That loss, combined with his scientific understanding of the sheer inefficiency and suffering built into the natural world, just made the concept of a benevolent, omnipotent designer impossible for him to maintain.
He struggled intensely with the problem of evil.
His most famous intellectual obstacle was the ichneumon wasp. He found this observation impossible to reconcile with a benevolent God. He noted that the wasp paralyzes caterpillars as live food for its own eggs. That level of designed cruelty, where suffering was built into the very structure of life and reproduction, stood as definitive evidence against divine benevolence for him.
Yet even in his agnosticism, he wasn't fully satisfied with a purely materialist universe, was he?
No. He confessed to the American botanist Asa Gray that he could not anyhow be contented to view this wonderful universe as the result of brute force. He struggled to give up the sense of a deep, ultimate order or a lawgiver, even if that lawgiver wasn't a personal, benevolent figure.
And his personal practice reflected that ambiguity.
It did. He stopped attending church around 1849, preferring Sunday walks instead. But he remained an active, respectful participant in local parish affairs at Down. He didn't become an aggressive atheist.
Then, in 1871, he finally tackled the subject he had skirted for so long: human origins and the descent of man and selection in relation to sex.
A huge book. It was comprehensive, providing extensive evidence that humans are integrated into the animal kingdom, demonstrating the continuity of both physical and mental attributes. But it also required the introduction of a second crucial mechanism to explain things like human differences and ornamentation.
Sexual selection.
Sexual selection.
Why was natural selection alone insufficient to explain characteristics that seem impractical for survival, like a peacock's tail?
Because natural selection favors survival, but sexual selection favors reproduction. Darwin noted that traits that seemed detrimental to survival, like the peacock's enormous, cumbersome tail, persisted because they provided a reproductive advantage.
How does it work?
It has two components: mate competition, which is usually male-to-male combat for access to females, and mate choice, which is usually female selection of the most attractive or vigorous partner.
And he applied this directly to humans.
Yes. He used it to explain secondary sexual characteristics, differences between the sexes, and even the evolution of culture art, and moral traits. He argued that these characteristics were shaped by competitive displays and choices made by our ancestors throughout human history.
Following that, in 1872, he published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, which was really a foundational text in psychology.
It was revolutionary. It explored the evolution of human emotions, blushing, smiling, anger, and demonstrated their continuity with animal behavior. He argued that expressions were often residual habits that had once served a practical function. It was so advanced it was one of a handful of the first books to use printed photographs to illustrate the universality of facial expressions across cultures.
And what was the reception to this work?
Darwin was relieved. He was impressed that his views were met with general assent. He remarked that nobody seemed shocked by the idea that human emotions were simply evolved animal behaviors, which is a huge change from the explosive reaction to origin 12 years earlier.
While all this controversy raged around human evolution, Darwin spent much of his later life absorbed in these highly meticulous botanical studies, perhaps as a necessary retreat to less contentious fields.
His botanical work was far from trivial, though. It continued to demonstrate the power of natural selection in complex, subtle ways. In Fertilization of Orchids, from 1862, he showed the delicate, co-evolved relationships between plants and insects, explaining how these incredibly complex structures arose through gradual selective pressure.
And this work led to one of his most famous scientific predictions.
It did. He examined the Madagascan star orchid, Angraecum sesquipedale. It had a nectary measuring 16 inches long.
16 inches?
An incredible structure. And Darwin predicted that such a feature must be pollinated by a huge moth with an equally long proboscis, a prediction that was spectacularly confirmed in 1903, decades after his death, when that exact species of moth was discovered.
He also published on insectivorous plants.
Yes, recognizing the evolutionary significance of carnivory in plants. And his final work, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, in 1881.
Which was a perfect encapsulation of his uniformitarian thinking, wasn't it?
A perfect bookend to his career. He demonstrated that the cumulative, continuous action of earthworms, these small, persistent forces, could move enormous amounts of soil and fundamentally shape the geological landscape. Small steps leading to massive, long-term change. That was the message of his entire life's work.
We should also acknowledge his consistent ethical stance on social issues throughout his life.
Absolutely. Darwin was a lifelong, passionate abolitionist. He vehemently argued against ranking the so-called races of man as distinct species. He maintained that Black people and Native populations possessed the same feelings and mental capabilities as Europeans, which was influenced in part by his early positive experience with John Edmonston.
And he was horrified by the violence he witnessed.
Genuinely horrified by the ill treatment and massacres of Native groups he had seen during the Beagle voyage, like the Patagonians.
He was cautious, though, about the emerging movement of eugenics, which was being advocated by his half-cousin, Francis Galton.
He was. He recognized Galton's argument that aiding the weak might endanger the benefits of natural selection by allowing unfavorable traits to persist. But, and this is the crucial distinction, Darwin warned against coercive eugenics.
Why?
Because he argued that withholding aid would severely endanger the instinct of sympathy, which he considered the noblest part of our nature. He chose to advocate only for publicizing the importance of inheritance, leaving individual choices untrammeled. His morality triumphed over a strict, unfeeling application of his own theory.
Darwin suffered from his chronic condition for decades. By 1882, physicians finally offered a diagnosis.
Angina pectoris, which was understood at the time as coronary thrombosis and heart disease.
He died at Down House on April 19, 1882, surrounded by his family.
His last words were an expression of profound appreciation for his wife, Emma, and his children. He told them, "I am not the least afraid of death. Remember what a good wife you have been to me. Tell all my children to remember how good they have been to me."
Despite expecting to be buried in the local churchyard at Down, his colleagues understood his monumental status.
A parliamentary petition was organized, and he was honored with a burial in Westminster Abbey.
A deeply symbolic gesture.
It placed him near Isaac Newton and John Herschel. It confirmed his status as an intellectual father of modern Britain, recognizing that his revolution transcended biology and reached into the very fabric of science.
Alfred Russel Wallace, his independent co-discoverer, provided a fitting epitaph.
He did. Wallace acknowledged that Darwin had wrought a greater revolution in human thought within a quarter of a century than any man of our time.
His work provided the organizing principle for all the life sciences, solving the mystery of both the unity of life
Through common descent
and the immense diversity of life.
Through natural selection. The biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky famously synthesized this legacy when he said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution."
And Darwin's name is now imprinted on the global landscape. Darwin Sound, Mount Darwin, the city of Darwin in Australia, all named during the Beagle voyage. His image was featured prominently on UK 10-pound banknotes for 17 years.
And a bronze statue of him, seated with his seminal Tree of Life sketch, resides in the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History.
Darwin's career really teaches us that revolutionary scientific breakthroughs are rarely simple flashes of genius.
No, they emerge from the methodical, painstaking collection of anomalies, from barnacles, finches, and fossils, combined with a necessary intellectual framework like Malthus's population principle, which provided the crucial engine to explain the selective forces at work.
And it is something truly profound to consider. Given Darwin's intensely personal experience of suffering, his chronic, mysterious illness, his fears of hereditary disease, and the devastating loss of his children, and his scientific recognition of the horrific suffering inherent in nature, like that ichneumon wasp.
How fundamentally did this personal experience of pain reinforce his rejection of divine design? How did it push him toward the acceptance of natural selection as a purely random yet immensely productive force for change?
It's the ultimate synthesis of private grief and scientific revolution. Thanks for listening.